Next day they loaded him aboard a train bound for civilization. At Fort Russell, the surgeons went to work, probing his wounds every day, but even they could not kill him. After 2 months, having regained the use of one eye, he traveled to California to recuperate, and in less than a year he was back on duty at Fort Laramie. So we are told by one historian, although another insists he toured Europe and did not return to active service until the fall of '79. In either case, 10 months or 3 years, the colonel was a sinewy bird. He himself found nothing remarkable about this experience. He had suffered, yes. He almost died, yes. But he was a warrior. He kept his feelings to himself. He said the reason the Indians did not renew their attack when General Crook withdrew from the Rosebud was, as we learned afterwards, that they were concerned about the approaching army of Terry and Custer. Crook bivouacked on Goose Creek after this indecisive, bloody battle, and it sounds like a pleasant interlude, not merely for the general, but for his troops. Big game hunting, deer, elk, bear, mountain sheep, and superb fishing. In one day, Captain Anson Mills and 2 enlisted men caught 146 trout. Crook himself caught 70 in a single afternoon. Major Noyes did not return from a fishing trip when expected, and it was feared that he might have drowned or been attacked by a bear or some other wild animal. But he was discovered asleep under a tree, exhausted by his great haul of fish. Bourke estimates that Crook and his men took more than 15,000 trout in 3 weeks, and I'm convinced that my figures are far below the truth. He says that his notebooks for this period resemble the chronicle of a sporting club. If not hunting or fishing, the troopers might amuse themselves with foot races or games of checkers and whist. Artistic soldiers passed the time sketching. Intellectuals discussed Macaulay and Shakespeare, while those who were not so intellectual speculated on the private life of one teamster, the fabulous Calamity Jane. On June 23rd, a lieutenant arrived from Fort Fetterman with news of the outside world. Especially interesting to Crook was the fact that one of his Civil War subordinates, Rutherford Hayes, had been nominated for the presidency. Crook thought well of Hayes and seemed pleased by the nomination. Still, he would rather have learned something about General Terry and Colonel Gibbon. They were on the march, he knew, but that was just about all he knew. And much comment, not unmixed with uneasiness, was occasioned thereby. 2 days later, Captain Mills, who had traveled to the northern peaks of the Bighorns on a reconnoitering expedition, observed smoke in the far northwest. Almost certainly this smoke arose from grass fires set by the Indians when they counterattacked Reno, and although Mills had no way of knowing this, he suspected there had been a fight. When he got back to camp on the night of June 25th, he reported what he had seen. Bourke writes that the failure to hear from either Terry or Gibbon distressed Crook more than he would admit. He feared for the worst, obliged to give ear to all the wild stories brought in by couriers. Gibbon, whom the Indians called No Hip Bone because of a Civil War injury, had assembled his column from 3 forts and a field camp in western Montana, collecting as many troops as could be spared without imperiling the lives of settlers. He set out for the rendezvous with 27 officers, 409 enlisted men, and a party of Crow scouts. According to Sheridan's master plan, he would meet Terry and Custer somewhere along the Yellowstone, above the hostile Sioux, while Crook would threaten them from below. Because he had a long way to travel and his units were dispersed and the snow was deep, Colonel Gibbon started in mid-March, south to the Yellowstone, then eastward. En route, his men discovered and tore apart a number of Indian burials. Chief of Scouts Bradley recorded in his journal that on Sunday, May 21st, he investigated certain reddish objects which were thought to be quarters of freshly butchered meat suspended from poles, but turned out to be moldy Sioux corpses wrapped in red blankets. The scaffolds on which they were placed had partly fallen, leaving the bodies half dangling. Bradley asked the squaw man, Tom LaForge, whose name he spelled LaForgy with a Y, maybe because that was how LaForge pronounced it. He asked LaForge to open one of these macabre bundles. It contained all that was left of a middle-aged warrior who had been dead about 2 years. His effects had been buried with him, and among them was a small package of letters, a soldier's hymn book, and a picture history of his life. The book had belonged to a soldier of some regiment of Iowa volunteers. There was also a paper signed Fanny Kelly, Captive White Woman, whose reading touched us all to the heart and made us wish the savage was again alive, that we might wreak upon him some of the indignation we felt. The captive had written that the Indians were kind to her, but she was compelled to do their bidding. Bradley digests this suggestive yet ambiguous remark, growing turgid with Christian rage. May the military operations that are now in progress result in so complete an overthrow of the hellhounds called Sioux. He must have been the first white man to read Mrs. Kelly's letter, which she wrote almost 11 years earlier, sometime during the last few months of 1864. She had been born in Canada, but her father emigrated to the American frontier, so Fanny grew up and got married in Kansas. At the age of 19, she started for Idaho with her husband Josiah, their adopted daughter, a friend named Wakefield, and 2 black servants who had once been Cherokee slaves. A few days on the road, they were joined by a Methodist preacher, then by another little family, and a Mr. Taylor. On July 12th, west of Fort Laramie, the landscape blossomed with 200 or 300 Oglala Sioux painted for war. The chief, Ottawa, Silverhorn, slapped himself on the chest, saying to Josiah Kelly, "Good Indian, me." Ottawa gestured at the others, saying, "Heap good Indian, hunt buffalo and deer." Nobody believed this, but they had no choice. Indians and emigrants shook hands. Everybody grinned and nodded. The Indians thought that they would like to trade one of their ponies for Josiah Kelly's racehorse, so he traded. They wanted flour, but after being given flour, they poured it on the ground, keeping only the sack. They wanted clothes, which they got. Now, more certain of themselves, one reached for Kelly's gun, which he would not surrender. Ottawa signaled that the emigrants might move on. Ahead lay a dark, rocky glen. Kelly refused to enter it. The Sioux then demanded a feast. Wakefield was getting provisions from a wagon. Kelly had wandered some distance away to gather firewood, and the preacher was distributing sugar when the Oglalas quit playing games. Fanny Kelly said she would never forget the face of Mr. Taylor when a bullet struck his forehead. He looked at me as he fell backward. One of the black servants dropped at her feet, writhing with arrows, and Sioux leaped into the wagons where they began to open boxes. After stealing whatever they wanted, the Indians set the wagons afire and rode off, taking Mrs. Kelly and her infant daughter. She did not know if her husband was dead or alive. She must have picked up the Sioux language quickly, because almost at once she realized what her captors thought about the inescapable war that was developing. The country across which they traveled was scarred by innumerable paths. Generation after generation of Indians followed the game herds, travois poles scoring the earth, and the invasion of this land was felt with deep bitterness. When trees were chopped down, when buffalo were slaughtered, when a train chugged across the horizon, all such signs of permanent possession by whites excited in these people a deadly hostility. The land was all they had. Should they give it up, then they must die, or submit to the laws of white men. So they killed, robbed, and harassed the foreigners. General Alfred Sully was trailing these Indians. When he got close, they turned back to fight. She said her feelings at this time, when she heard rifle shots and the boom of a cannon, her feelings were indescribable. She believed the soldiers would overtake Ottawa's village. But after a while, the warriors brought back trophies. Reeking scalps, soldiers' uniforms covered with blood. One Indian showed her a letter taken from a dead soldier in which he wrote that the topographical engineer had been killed, but Sully's men caught 2 of the Red Devils, cut off their heads, and displayed them on poles. Despite this letter and other such examples of white savagery, several Oglalas died after eating poisoned crackers, she remained a frontier woman who spoke with contempt of the sugar plum and rosewater policy endorsed by peace advocates. An Oglala boy died along the way. They wrapped his body in curtains that had once draped the windows of her home in Kansas. They placed him on a scaffold with a red blanket and a few items for use in the land of the white buffalo, and continued traveling. On the high plains, a band of Unkpapas became her temporary custodians, because these Oglalas wanted their government allowance, and they reasoned, quite correctly from the American point of view, that it would be undiplomatic to present themselves at the agency with a white captive. Her last days among these people obliged her to witness a massacre. Settlers on a Yellowstone flatboat made the mistake of camping ashore. None survived. The scalps included that of a woman with beautiful chestnut hair about 4 feet long. But the brave who took this prize did not join the celebration that night. She asked why he was not dancing, so he went into his lodge and came out with a blood-soaked dress. He explained that he had been thinking. It seemed to Mrs. Kelly that he was confused by a sense of remorse, because he had been taught that it was honorable to kill women and children. In late November, following negotiations with officers at Fort Sully, she was turned over to some Blackfeet who would escort her to the fort. Along the way, they crossed a formation of sandy ridges where she noticed seashells. She asked how shells came to be on these summits, and was told that a great sea rolled over the face of this country. Only one man escaped. He sailed around with his family until the flood receded. Then he became the father of all Indians. Officers at Fort Sully had been led to think the Blackfeet would release her in exchange for presents, by which stratagem several Blackfeet would be able to get inside the stockade. Once inside, they could prevent the gates from being closed, while a war party which was hiding nearby would ride down from the hills. Then everybody in the fort could be murdered. It was a good plan, and except for Mrs. Kelly it would have worked. By this time, however, she understood Sioux pretty well, and during the negotiations she managed to warn the gullible white men. Fort Sully was not strong. In the opinion of almost everybody stationed there during the winter of 1864-5, the thing that saved them was an almost illegible note Mrs. Kelly had written with a soft lead bullet on a page torn from a business ledger. On December 12th, the Blackfeet delivered her. They must have felt cheated when the gates quickly closed. Her husband was alive. When their wagon train was attacked, it had been almost sunset, and in the falling darkness he escaped. So they were reunited, but she found him dramatically changed. His hair was beginning to turn gray, although they had been separated just 5 months. On the night she was captured, she had somehow been able to hide her daughter, telling the child to lie still, that they were only a few miles from help, and that next day the soldiers from Fort Laramie would find her. The child eventually was found dead, 3 arrows in her body, and scalped. Having been told of this, Mrs. Kelly reflected upon it with the sentiment of an era long gone, with a prose style whose complexity indicates a much higher level of public education in those days. Surely he who numbers the sparrows and feeds the ravens was not unmindful of her in that awful hour, but allowed the heavenly kingdom to which her trembling soul was about to take its flight to sweeten with a glimpse of its beatific glory the bitterness of death, even as the martyr Stephen, seeing the bliss above, could not be conscious of the torture below. Lieutenant Bradley mentioned in his journal that after finding a paper signed by Fanny Kelly on a Sioux burial scaffold, he thought the name sounded familiar. For a long time he puzzled over this. At last it occurred to him. I'd somewhere read an account of her ransom a few years ago, followed afterward by an announcement that she had written and published a book of her experiences. He does not say what she wrote on the scrap of paper, but it probably had nothing to do with the scheme to overrun Fort Sully, or he would have commented. The message must have been one of several that she left along the way, or entrusted to Indians who appeared sympathetic and who frequently visited the settlements. Why the Indian kept this note instead of delivering it to a white who could read English and would perhaps give him a reward is a mystery. Other letters, just as incomprehensible to Indians who kept them, turned up in various hostile villages, and journalists at the 1867 Medicine Lodge Peace Conference observed Cheyenne squaws collecting discarded envelopes, hiding envelopes in their clothing or riding off with a handful. Pale-face calligraphy attracted them, but why? Maybe they thought if they looked at the writing long enough, they would be able to communicate as the whites did. Whatever his particular reason, a middle-aged Sioux, dead 2 years when LaForge tore apart his scaffold, had kept Mrs. Kelly's message. Lieutenant Bradley concentrates on the sinister phrase, compelled to do their bidding. He cannot get over it. He repeats it with an exclamation. Alas, he goes on, how many poor captive women have suffered this, to them worst fate than death. She was not sexually abused. Not by Oglalas, Unkpapas, or Blackfeet. They ordered her about with harshness and cruelty, yet I had never suffered from any of them the slightest personal or unchaste insult. Let me bear testimony to this redeeming feature in their treatment of me. These were the Sioux, independent, implacable. General Crook had assaulted them twice with superior force, and both times drew back. Now, irritated and baffled, he camped alongside Goose Creek in the afternoon shade of the Bighorns while he waited for news. 3 columns had been ordered to converge on these people like the talons of a carnivorous bird on a pigeon. Although Crook was disabled, the other talons were moving. From Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory came Terry and Custer, alert for signs of the enemy, looking up the Yellowstone for Gibbon's scouts. Down the north bank of the Yellowstone came Gibbon, preceded by Lieutenant Bradley, Tom LaForge, and 23 apprehensive Crows who knew all too much about the Sioux. On May 23rd, 2 days after Bradley discovered Mrs. Kelly's letter on a scaffold, 3 men drifted out of Gibbon's camp to do a little hunting. They were ambushed in a ravine and killed. Dr. Paulding's autopsy, dispassionate and professional, illustrates the abruptness of death on this frontier. Private Augustine Stoker gave up the ghost because 2 bullets passed through the left side of the lower jaw and exited on the opposite, carrying away most of his tongue. A 3rd bullet caught him on the right frontal eminence, exiting close to the right ear. 2 knives were driven into his brain, 1 above and behind, and 1 below left ear and left sticking in body. A 4th bullet through the head exited behind, creating an orifice from which brain escaped. Lesser injuries might not have been fatal. Bullets through both elbow joints. Private Henry Rehmeyer, spelled R-A-H-M-E-I-R. Paulding spells it R-E-H-M-E-Y-E-R. Skull mashed in with butt of gun or a rock, left earlobe cut off. Teamster Quinn, spelled with 2 N's, Paulding spells it with 1. Bullet behind mastoid, processed downward into neck, 2 tomahawk fractures. Dr. Paulding here makes a slight mistake. The Sioux did not have tomahawks. Quinn's head was fractured with an axe or a hatchet. As for Paulding's eccentric orthography, it was habitual. Indeed, he had problems writing his own name, often transposing letters so that occasionally he wrote Pauldnig. One might feel suspicious of a doctor with such a visual or mental disturbance, but there seems to be no indication that it affected his work. The Journal of Captain Henry Freeman also mentions this incident, if rather casually. After noting that these 3 men left camp without permission, he goes on to say that a trader named Chestnut came downriver from Bozeman. He asks 8 cents for potatoes, $1 for butter and eggs. Don't want any at that price. Want eggs bad enough, but can't afford it. Had 2 letters from Sally. Indians were reported to be crossing the river. Somebody named Thompson bought all of the beer on Mr. Chestnut's boat, 8 gallons, and that night gave a party in his tent. As for the reckless hunters, they were stitched into blankets and buried in a single grave, while a band of Sioux observed the ceremony from across the Yellowstone. Stoker lies to the south, next to the tree, Paulding wrote. Quinn wrapped in 2 blankets in the center. Rehmeyer to the north, wrapped in a blanket, and covered also with a green blanket put on the body by Show His Face, the Crow chief, to testify his grief. Paulding notes on May 28th that Colonel Gibbon seems in bad shape, much alarmed by the proximity of Indians. He is trembling and frightened, so it's pitiable to see him. If I'm to be under the command of such imbecile-damned fools, I think I'll get out of it as soon as possible. Colonel Gibbon was not the only one with a stomach full of butterflies. Bradley reported that his Crow scouts were mortally afraid. There is no reason to doubt Bradley's appraisal, yet this remark could be misleading. As Linderman points out, the Crows frequently were at war with surrounding tribes of Sioux, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and Blackfeet, and the mere fact that they could survive when outnumbered and encircled was an eloquent proclamation of bravery. June 5th is very warm. After making camp, they roll up the sides of the tents and loiter in the shade, reading newspapers or books, writing letters, playing cards, talking, dozing. Bradley describes an agreeable prelude to supper when nutmeg, lemon, sugar, Angostura bitters, champagne cider, and spiritus frumenti are brought out to make toddies and cocktails. In the dusk of evening, when most of the officers were gathered in front of some of the tents, a chorus of cavalrymen not far away burst forth with a round of merry camp songs that came pleasantly to the ear and suspended for a time the conversation upon battles we haven't fought and victories we haven't won. And when taps imposed silence upon the enlisted men, the officers who enjoyed larger liberties took up the suspended harmony and woke the night air with many a song of sentiment and jollity. We have a number of very sweet singers in our company. It's hard to realize, when about the camp, that we are an invading army, liable at any moment to be engaged in deadly conflict with a cruel foe. In this leisurely manner, intermittently punctuated by moments of wild activity, the Montana column wound eastward, preceded by Crow scouts, examining the earth and remote bluffs for any sign of Sioux, and looking downstream for another Bluecoat army. Colonel Gibbon is not quite what one expects of a West Point soldier. He seems less narrowly focused, at times digressing like a scholar educated in the liberal arts. Some days before the rendezvous with General Terry, a party of horsemen was reported coming down Rosebud Creek on the opposite side of the Yellowstone, and because they must be from Terry's command, Gibbon ordered 2 Crows to deliver a message. He watched them get ready for this cold, dangerous swim by smearing themselves with red paint. I had the curiosity to inquire the object of this, and was surprised to learn that it was to protect them against the attack of alligators. As the alligator is an animal unknown to the waters of this region, the fact referred to is a curious evidence of the southern origin of the Crows. Although it is not definitely established where these people came from, Gibbon probably was correct. Linderman, who knew them well, states that they often mentioned alligators and sea monsters, despite the fact that they were Plains Indians, which led him also to believe that the tribe at one time lived much farther south. Linguistically, they belong to the large Siouan group, and are thus related to the Hidatsas, from whom they separated, according to tradition, during an argument over the stomach of a buffalo. Supposedly, this happened about the end of the 17th century. The Crows, all in a snit, moved toward the Black Hills, which they apparently liked, but were driven into Montana by the more numerous Sioux and Cheyennes. Absaroka, they called themselves. Absanoki it was originally pronounced, which has been translated as Sparrowhawk people, but may signify chosen people, this latter being a universal conceit. Lieutenant Bradley insists that the correct spelling is Upsaroku, spelled U-P-S-A-H-R-O-K-U. He says the meaning has been lost. The medicine woman, Pretty Shield, agreed, saying that she did not know what it meant and never had met any man or woman who did. Dr. W.J. McGee, director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, said it meant something like great warrior people, and that the Crows, after they came to know and respect white soldiers, applied this self-congratulatory name to the whites as a way of complimenting them. The final word, so to speak, comes from tribal historian Joseph Medicine Crow, who says Absaroka is now an obsolete expression. Why they became known as Crows is not clear. In the Hidatsa dialect of North Dakota, Abisa means large-beaked, Roka means its children, so once upon a time some crow may have pointed to a corvine bird while trying to interpret the tribal name. They were lighter in color than Sioux, which made them less frightening. Beaux hommes, they were called by Chevalier de la Vérendrye and his companions who met them in the mid-18th century. This judgment was repeated a century later by Captain William Reynolds, who described them as nicely formed, of medium height, sporting buffalo hide caps trimmed into points, imparting a decidedly regal appearance. Reynolds also mentions how they gloried in long hair, letting it hang down to their knees and saturating it with gum until the hair formed a solid mass, which they enhanced with dots of white paint. More than any other Indians, they were noted for the prodigious length of their hair. George Catlin saw many Crows whose hair swept the ground when they walked, giving exceeding grace and beauty to their movements. Every morning they oiled it with bear grease, which he thought might account for the luxuriant growth. General Crook's army met these exotic allies in northern Wyoming. Adjutant Bourke felt that in stature, dress, and demeanor they were preferable to the enemy Sioux. He, too, remarked on their light skin, which he thought might be attributed to living in a cool, mountainous atmosphere. Lieutenant Edward McGuire, who was an engineer with Terry, first saw them on the Yellowstone when the two columns joined. A very handsome set of men, extremely good-natured. McGuire thought they looked more aggressive than did the Rees, and he found their language quite musical, not unlike Spanish. Terry had left Fort Abraham Lincoln with a band of Ree scouts, 3 1/2 infantry columns, the entire 7th Cavalry, a battery of Gatling guns, a wagon train, and a beef herd. The exact number of officers and men is disputed. Major George Gillespie, chief engineer of the military division of the Missouri, stated in his 1876 annual report that there were 30 Indian scouts, 45 officers, and 906 enlisted men. Gillespie, though, did not accompany this task force, whereas the lieutenant did. McGuire lists 45 scouts, guides, and interpreters, 50 officers, 968 men, 190 civilian employees, and 1,694 animals, which sounds as though he walked the length of the column with a tablet. Whatever the facts, this was a formidable aggregation. It should scatter the hostiles like dust in a windstorm. Private Henry Bailey wrote to his mother a couple of weeks before leaving Fort Lincoln that they intended to wallop the medicine man. He would think he was in a hornet's nest, wrote Bailey, when the 7th got after him. And to an unidentified correspondent, he wrote that although he did not know where they were going, he thought it was somewhere up around the Bighorn and Powder Rivers. Old Sitting Bull has sent word that if we come up there, he will have all our scalps, but I think the old boy is mistaken. He's got a bad crowd to fool with, and had better keep quiet. Bailey was the blacksmith of Captain Miles Keogh's company, which was wiped out. Private Coleman had better luck. He served with Captain Thomas McDougall's company, which guarded the pack train and lost only 2 men. In October, after a safe return, he transcribed his journal into a 3-by-5-inch leather-bound notebook addressed to his sister. I am going to send you an account of our campaign against the Sioux this summer. I have kept this diary for future reference. We left Fort Lincoln on the 17th of May on a campaign against the Sioux. How many Gatling guns lurched and bumped across the prairie is uncertain, probably 3. Sergeant John Ryan of M Company listed 2 Gatlings, 1 24-pound brass Napoleon cannon, and a Rodman, this being a small cannon with a rifled barrel. While en route, they were reinforced by a company of the 6th Infantry and another Gatling. So there may have been 5 mechanical weapons. Ryan's narrative was published in the Hardin Tribune in 1923, 47 years after the event. In at least a few details, it is demonstrably inaccurate. The black interpreter's name, for example, was not Izar, but Isaiah. Regarding the big brass cannon, it has been listed elsewhere as a 12-pounder. The size, though, is not important. What matters is that some heavy artillery did reach the Yellowstone and must have been dragged up the Little Bighorn, because, according to the testimony of a former Confederate soldier named Houston who joined the Sioux, scouts hurried into Sitting Bull's camp reporting the approach of 2 bang guns. Whether the imminent arrival of this artillery persuaded the Indians to leave the valley is not known. There is no doubt that many warriors wanted to continue the fight, but Sitting Bull concluded the signs were no longer auspicious. 2 bang guns, or 2 bang guns, might have seemed inauspicious. Still, his warriors had just broken the back of the most powerful offensive unit on the frontier, Custer's gung-ho regiment, 32 officers and 718 enlisted men, more or less. Bismarck Tribune correspondent Mark Kellogg noted in his first dispatch that 1,207 men left Fort Lincoln, counting soldiers, re-scouts, civilian mule packers, herdsmen, teamsters, wheelwrights, guides, et al. Kellogg's figures for these components do not total 1,207, but very few things about this expedition do add up. Somewhere between Fort Lincoln and the Yellowstone, according to the Arikara narrative, Custer and a scout rode so far ahead that they were out of sight. When the column reached a fork in the trail, nobody knew which way they had gone. Custer's Negro servant Isa was asked. This might have been Isaiah Dorman, although it is strange that he would be called Custer's servant. Isaiah knew no more than anybody else. Nevertheless, he was asked which way to go, and unwisely he recommended one of the forks. He guessed wrong. Custer was furious when he learned the army had been misdirected. An Arikara coming down out of the hills told of seeing the black man on his knees in front of Custer, weeping and pleading for mercy while the general cursed him. And the next day, as punishment, Isa had to walk. This may or may not have occurred. Such a grotesque incident ought to crop up in a good many journals, especially those kept by men who despised Custer. But only the Arikara scout Red Star mentions it. Assuming it did happen, How would Custer have treated a white who misdirected the army? Custer probably would not have driven a white man to his knees, not in public. However, he did sometimes use the lash, and it is at least possible that a white would have been ceremonially lashed instead of being forced to walk. Hundreds of soldiers walked all the way from Fort Lincoln, and hundreds of Gibbon's men walked all over Montana, so in that respect, such punishment would be a tap on the wrist. Maybe the incident, if it occurred, had nothing to do with color. The general's rage was spasmodic and unpredictable. During an 1874 trip through the Black Hills, he got mad at Bloody Knife, yanked out a revolver, and began shooting. Whether he meant to kill Bloody Knife or only scare him, we do not know. Neither did Bloody Knife, who jumped behind a tree. This affair, too, could be interpreted as racial, except that fair-skinned, blue-eyed Lonesome Charlie also jumped behind a tree. On one occasion, Tom Custer overslept, so the general set fire to the grass outside his tent. Another time he entered the tent while Brother Tom was enjoying a leisurely breakfast and kicked over the table. Subordinates walked softly around him. What does one make of such a man? Says Mr. Vandewater, who did not think highly of the general, his strange personality can no more be determined now than one may fix the taste of wine by examining an empty bottle. What other commandant would have included a 16-piece band mounted on white horses? A recruit named Jacob Horner said that while traveling through rugged territory, Custer ordered the musicians to dismount, clamber up a rocky hillside, and perform. Custer wanted his band on the battlefield, wherever it might be, but Terry would not consent, so chief musician Felix Venaturi and his instrumentalists dismounted for the last time at the confluence of the Powder and the Yellowstone, where a supply depot had been established. Here, at this desolate seam in the universe, where two sluggish rivers joined, a party of enlisted men, officers, and Venaturi's Germanic musicians, Privates Arndt, Baumbach, Einenberger, Emmerich, Griesner, Jungsbluth, Neubuchler, Rudolph, a few Englishmen, and one Bernard O'Neill, waved goodbye to the Fighting Seventh and to the band's white horses, which Custer had annexed. Jacob Horner was one of those recruits who walked all the way from Fort Lincoln. He and the others may have looked forward to an exciting battle with the Sioux, or at least pretended to, but they were tired and their feet hurt, and it is not likely they objected when they were assigned to guard General Terry's depot. Horner drew picket duty on the hills, and there he stayed from June 11th until July 4th, when the Far West barged downstream with a cargo of wounded soldiers, and a tale that scarcely anybody could believe. Horner was Alsatian, the son of a baker who must not have thought much of America because he returned to Europe after 6 years. Jacob did like this country. At least he wanted to see more of it than he saw as a child. He came back alone when he was 15, worked along the Atlantic seaboard, and by 1875 had become a meat cutter in New Orleans. However, the Gulf climate oppressed him, so he started up the Mississippi, stopping at a plantation to butcher cattle. A dog began to follow him around. Some children threw rocks at the dog. Jacob got mad and hit a boy who ran away screaming because Jacob's hands were red with cattle blood. In the Southern tradition, therefore, a mob gathered to lynch the foreigner, and Jacob spent the next few days hiding in a swamp. In St. Louis, he resumed his sanguine trade, and he contemplated recruiting posters, which described wonderful times out west. On April 7, 1876, he presented himself at Jefferson Barracks. The government found him a trifle short, but allowed him to stand on tiptoe. The surgeon who inspected him asked about a scar running the length of his left arm. He explained that in Alsace, a streak of lightning had entered the chimney of his parents' home, flashed through the bedroom, and seared him. It never bothered him, he said, and because he could flex that arm about as well as the other one, the Army signed him up. He was assigned to K Company, 7th Cavalry, and quickly found himself en route to Fort Snelling, Minnesota, where he became a working soldier on April 18th, although there had been no time for basic training. A few days later, his unit headed west. On May 1st, they reached Fort Lincoln. 2 weeks later, they started for the Little Bighorn. So he came to the junction of the Powder and the Yellowstone, and there he walked the hills. 3 or 4 Ree scouts stopped at the depot not long after the Little Bighorn battle. They asked for a piece of canvas. They drew pictures on the canvas, but nobody could understand what the pictures meant. On July 4th, the horseless Teutonic Band assembled to celebrate American independence, while Private Jacob Horner took his place in ranks, prepared to fire a 3-volley salute. They got off one volley, which was answered by a steamboat whistle. They put down their guns and ran to the riverbank. They saw the far west approaching, with hay strewn all over the deck, and wounded men lying on blankets. Custer had expected to command the entire Fort Lincoln army, not just the cavalry, but he had annoyed Ulysses Grant. It seems that any professional soldier would be more prudent. Not Custer. He testified against Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, who had been accused of accepting bribes, specifically $24,450 for awarding the Fort Sill sutler's rights to one John Evans, and he let it be known that he did not think much of the president's brother Orville, whose palm had been crossed with silver more than once. Grant, personally incorruptible but quite touchy, retaliated by forbidding Custer to join the campaign against the Sioux, and it was only through the intercession of Generals Terry and Sheridan, who wanted him in the field, that Grant relented. It is said that while imploring Terry to intercede, Custer, with tears in his eyes, actually got down on his knees. G.A.C. on his knees. We imagine him as reckless, brave, arrogant, foolish, heartless, but not supplicating. He never begged, he never wept. It would be easier to visualize Patton kneeling on the carpet in front of Eisenhower. Now, after a century, with this dashing cavalier embedded like a fossil in American folklore, such a tableau sounds repugnant and absurd. Yet the excruciating moment was witnessed by Terry's brother-in-law, Colonel Robert Hughes. On May 6th, following military protocol, Custer addressed President Grant via the Adjutant General, Division of the Missouri. I have seen your order transmitted through the General of the Army directing that I be not permitted to accompany the expedition about to move against hostile Indians. As my entire regiment forms a part of the proposed expedition, and as I am the senior officer of the regiment on duty in this department, I respectfully but most earnestly request that while not allowed to go in command of the expedition, I may be permitted to serve with my regiment in the field. I appeal to you as a soldier to spare me the humiliation of seeing my regiment march to meet the enemy, and I not to share its dangers. Signed, G.A. Custer, Brevet Major General, USA. To this petition, General Terry added a respectful postscript, stating that while he had no desire to question the President's orders, he felt that Custer's services in the field would be valuable. Sheridan, at division headquarters in Chicago, forwarded these supplications to Brigadier E.D. Townsend in Washington, with his own endorsement, which reads in part, On a previous occasion, in 1868, I asked executive clemency for Colonel Custer to enable him to accompany his regiment against the Indians, and I sincerely hope, if granted this time, it will have sufficient effect to prevent him from again attempting to throw discredit on his profession and his brother officers. Sherman quickly telegraphed Terry, The dispatch of General Sheridan in closing years of yesterday, touching General Custer's urgent request to go under your command with his regiment, has been submitted to the President, who sends me word that if you want General Custer along, he withdraws his objections. Advise Custer to be prudent, not to take along any newspaper men who always work mischief, and to abstain from any personalities in the future. Tell him I want him to confine his whole mind to his legitimate office. Why he was esteemed as an Indian fighter is puzzling. None of his frontier campaigns demonstrated particular skill or insight. Not that they were botched, just that his strategy could not be called brilliant. During an attack on a Cheyenne village in 1868, his regiment escaped possible annihilation because of a superb feint, for which he usually receives credit, but this maneuver may have been suggested by his chief of scouts, Ben Clark. Custer's most evident assets seem to have been relentless courage and vitality. He could be likened more to an actor than to a playwright. Invariably, he gives the impression of a man on stage performing as he has been instructed to perform, delivering lines composed by somebody else. Throughout the Civil War, his smashing victories were plotted by other men. Gregg was in command at Gettysburg, Torbert at Cedarville, Merritt at Winchester, Sheridan at Yellow Tavern, Crook at Sailor's Creek. In a tight situation, his response was instantaneous and predictable. He charged. This response to challenge was not something he learned. He reacted as instinctively as a Miura fighting bull. When he was a schoolboy, he once drove his fist through a window at a classmate outside who was making faces at him. Such uncontrolled violence quite often will carry the day, although not necessarily. At Trevilian Station, for instance, he moved too fast, lost his personal baggage, and nearly lost the brigade. Even now, after 100 years, his name alone will start an argument. More significant men of his time can be discussed without passion, because they are inextricably woven into a tapestry of the past. But this Hotspur refuses to die. He stands forever on that dusty Montana slope. As values change, so does one's evaluation of the past and one's impression of long-gone actors. New myths replace the old. During the 19th century, G.A.C. was vastly admired. Today his image has fallen face down in the mud, and his middle initial, which stands for Armstrong, could mean anathema. Paul Hutton, writing in the Western Historical Quarterly, observed that as America's concept of the frontier evolved from that of a desert resisting civilization to that of a refuge from civilized decadence, so did Americans begin to look differently at the men and women who participated in settling that distant territory. Thus, from a symbol of courage and sacrifice in the winning of the West, Custer's image was gradually altered into a symbol of the arrogance and brutality displayed in the white exploitation. The only constant factor in this reversed legend is a remarkable disregard for historical fact. That he was vigorous and gallant never has been denied, even by those who detested him, and he seems to have been fortuitously noticed by his superiors. During the Civil War, he advanced with extraordinary speed, brigadier at 23, one of our youngest general officers, and by the time he galloped across the plains, he was a national totem. How odd that this consummate thespian's greatest role was a flop. One feels obligated to ask why. On July 7, 1876, the New York Herald published an interview with an officer in Philadelphia who, as the saying goes, did not care to have his name mentioned. This man knew the young general, whom he compared to a thermometer, and his diagnosis may be correct. The truth about Custer is that he was a pet soldier who had risen not above his merit, but higher than men of equal merit. He fought with Phil Sheridan, and through the patronage of Sheridan he rose. But while Sheridan liked his valor and dash, he never trusted his judgment. He was to Sheridan what Murat was to Napoleon. While Sheridan is always cool, Custer is always aflame. Rising to high command early in life, he lost the repose necessary to success in high command. His rapid promotion is surprising, because at West Point he unfurled less like a flower than a weed, graduating 34th in a class of 34. He accumulated 726 demerits, known as skins, which placed him comfortably ahead of, or behind, Cadet George Watt, who graduated next to last with 695 skins. Patrick Henry O'Rourke, the top graduate, who might have become famous, was killed at Gettysburg. Delinquency records are preserved in West Point archives, so Cadet Custer's illegitimate activities, together with his demerits, may be scrutinized. E.g., September 29, 1857, trifling in ranks, marching from parade, 3. December 19, 1857, highly unmilitary and trifling conduct, throwing stones on post, 3:30 and 4 p.m., 4. December 19, 1857, calling corporal in a boisterous tone of voice, 3 p.m., 3. February 21, 1858, unauthorized articles in ventilator, 3. March 8, 1858, cooking utensils in chimney, 3. April 3, 1858, hair out of uniform at guard meeting, 2. May 14, 1858, gazing about in ranks at guard meeting, 2. July 26, 1858, rubbish behind tent, 3. January 26, 1859, late at parade, 1. January 27, 1859, late at formation of company at M.H. at dinner, 1. January 27, 1859, late at formation of company at M.H. at dinner, 1. January 27, 1859, late at supper, R.C., 1. January 30th, 1859, late at breakfast, R.C., 1. February 5th, 1859, laughing and talking in Drawing Academy on 4th, 2. February 17th, 1859, throwing snowballs on stoops of barracks, 1:30 and 2 p.m., 3. March 18th, 1859, throwing bread in M.H. at dinner, on 17th, 2. April 22nd, 1859, making boisterous noise in sink, 7 and 8 p.m., 3. November 19th, 1859, idle, laughing, and talking in Drawing Academy, on 15th, 3. February 17th, 1860, wall defaced with pencil marks, 9:30 and 10 a.m., 4. March 19th, 1860, room grossly out of order, bed down, and floor not swept, 9:30 and 10 a.m., 4. March 19th, 1860, bread, butter, potatoes, plates, knives, and forks in quarters, 9:30 and 10 a.m., 3. July 4th, 1860, swinging arms marching from dinner, 1. February 3rd, 1861, long beard at inspection, paragraph 173, Army Regs, 2. March 10th, 1861, long hair at inspection, paragraph 173, Army Regs, 2. April 3rd, 1861, throwing snowballs in vicinity of barracks, 4 and 5 p.m., paragraph 194, Army Regs, 3. June 4th, 1861, sitting at window in shirt sleeves with feet in window sill, 11 a.m., Camp Police Regs, 2. June 15th, 1861, unauthorized ornament on coat marching off guard, 2. June 22nd, 1861, too much furniture in tent at morning inspection, 1. June 23rd, 1861, swinging arms marching from pub of delinquencies, 1. June 27th, 1861, swinging arms marching from pub of delinquencies, 1. He was as profane, libidinous, and alcoholic as the average cadet, possibly more so. Beyond doubt, he was contrary and eccentric. One of his roommates later recalled his absolute indifference to everything. It was all right with him whether he knew his lesson or not. He did not allow it to trouble him. West Point had never been afflicted with a less promising pupil, remarked one biographer, and Custer himself observed that his days at the academy might be studied by future cadets as an example to be avoided. Nobody has yet managed to explain his remarkable ascent. As a lieutenant at Bull Run, he was cited for bravery, and by August of that year, 2 months out of West Point, he was an aide to Brigadier General Philip Kearny. In the spring of 1862, while serving under General William F. Baldy Smith, he ascended quite literally. Professor T.S.C. Lowe, a balloonist, had been employed by the Union to spy on Confederate forces near Richmond, but Lowe reported clouds of dust, new earthworks, a large encampment, and great activity. Smith therefore directed Custer to take a notebook, pencil, compass, and field glasses, hop into the basket, go up, and see what he could see. This order was received, Custer admits, with no little trepidation, for although I had chosen the mounted service from preference alone, yet I had a choice as to the character of the mount, and the proposed ride was far more elevated than I had ever desired or contemplated. There is a photograph of him. It could hardly be anybody else, standing like a mannequin in the gondola, which is elegantly decorated with big stars and vertical stripes. It appears to be 30 or 40 feet up, and is being restrained by a ground crew hanging on to the ropes. The thing was tethered near Baldy Smith's headquarters, like a wild and untamable animal, which Custer approached reluctantly. Previous to this time, I'd never even examined a balloon except from a distance. Being interested in their construction, I was about to institute a thorough examination of all its parts, when the aeronaut announced that all was ready. He inquired whether I desired to go up alone, or he should accompany me. My desire, if frankly expressed, would have been not to go up at all, but if I was to go, company was certainly desirable. With an attempt at indifference, I intimated that he might go along. The basket in which we were to be transported was about 2 feet high, 4 feet long, and slightly over half as wide, resembling in every respect an ordinary willow basket of the same dimensions, minus the handles. This basket was attached to the cords of the balloon. Stepping inside, my assistant, after giving directions to the men holding the 4 ropes, told me to take my place in the basket. I complied, and before being fully aware that such was the fact, found that we were leaving terra firma, and noiselessly, almost imperceptibly, were ascending toward the clouds. The assistant was standing upright, supporting himself by the iron band, placed for that purpose about 2 feet above the top of the basket. I was urged to stand up also. My confidence in balloons at that time was not sufficient, however, to justify such a course, and so I remained seated in the bottom of the basket with a firm hold upon either side. I first turned my attention to the manner in which the basket had been constructed. To me it seemed fragile indeed, and not intended to support a tithe of the weight then imposed upon it. The interstices in the sides and bottom seemed immense, and the further we receded from the earth, the larger they seemed to become, until I almost imagined one might tumble through. I interrogated my companion as to whether the basket was actually and certainly safe. He responded affirmatively. At the same time, as if to confirm his assertion, he began jumping up and down. The balloon reached an altitude of about 1,000 feet, by which time Custer had somewhat regained his confidence. To his right he could see the York River flowing into Chesapeake Bay, to his left the James, and between them the theater of operations for 2 great armies. With field glasses, whenever the balloon momentarily stabilized, he could distinguish the outlines of earthworks, tents, and heavy guns, peering sullenly through the embrasures. He himself was observed. Soldiers gathered around their entrenchments, staring up at the giant balloon. Why didn't they shoot at him? They knew he was spying, he was within artillery range, and improvised platforms could have elevated the trajectory of cannonballs. Yet they did nothing except gawk, as though transfixed by the apparition. Baldy Smith thought the survey useful, and ordered him aloft almost every day until the Confederates retreated. In May of the same year, during the struggle for Richmond, he was noticed by General McClellan. It had become imperative to cross the Chickahominy, but the bridge was gone, and the Confederates held the opposite bank. McClellan's chief engineer needed to know if the stream could be forded, so he turned to Custer, who jumped in and waded across, a large, slow target. If one rebel had been alert, he would have caught a bullet in the chest. He knew this, yet it is said that he leaped into the stream without pausing to remove his tunic. In 1876, General McClellan wrote to his widow, "He was reported to me as having accomplished an act of desperate gallantry. I sent for him at once, and after thanking him, asked what I could do for him. He seemed to attach no importance to what he had done, and desired nothing, whereupon I asked him if he would like to come upon my staff as captain. He gladly accepted, and remained with me until I was relieved of my command." During that ferocious summer he killed a man, probably his first. At White Oak Swamp, his regiment, under the command of Colonel Averill, hit and broke the enemy position. Custer began chasing an officer mounted on a thoroughbred. In a letter to his sister Lydia Ann, he confided that it was the most exciting sport he had ever known. "I selected him as my game." They jumped a rail fence, and Custer became increasingly excited. He yelled at the rebel to surrender, but got no response, so he fired. Nothing happened. He fired again. The Confederate reeled in the saddle, hung on for a moment, and fell to the ground. Custer rode past him in search of other game, and some time later saw the riderless horse, which he recognized by a red morocco breast strap. "I have him yet, and intend to keep him." The saddle, which I also retain, is a splendid one, covered with black morocco and ornamented with silver nails. A lieutenant who witnessed the shooting said the Confederate officer got to his feet, turned around, threw up both hands, and died with blood gushing from his mouth. Custer wrote to Lydia, "It was his own fault. I told him twice to surrender." Who this affluent rebel was who rode to war with such sumptuous equipment, nobody knows. Not only did Custer pick up an expensive ornate saddle and a thoroughbred, he got the victim's unusual double-edged sword, its blade engraved in Spanish. "No me saques sin razón, no me envaines sin honor." That is, "Draw me not without reason, nor sheathe me without honor." Because the engraving is in Spanish, this blade always is described as Toledo steel, but after going over it with the jeweler's loop, the eminent Custer historian, Lawrence Frost, could find nothing to verify this. Indeed, close to the hilt were a few nearly obliterated letters, which he read as Zollingen, a German city noted for hardware. The blade is about 3 inches longer and half an inch wider than the standard cavalry weapon, and weighs very nearly twice as much, indicating that the Confederate must have been a big, powerful man. Custer himself stood less than 6 feet and was thin, but the fact that he carried and used this sword seems to substantiate the legend of his physical strength. However, the size of it is less interesting than his occasional habit of buckling it on while reenacting the enemy's death. He liked swords, and apparently collected them with the innocent pleasure of those who collect cognac bottles or postage stamps. One of these weapons, which Dr. Frost acquired, has an unusually short blade with an ivory-channeled grip, the pommel consisting of a gold-plated lion's head with ruby-like eyes. It probably was made in England, and might have belonged to one of his ancestors. Then there is a militia officer's sword with a mother-of-pearl grip and a brass pommel in the shape of a knight's helmet. It dates from the mid-19th century and was manufactured in Chicopee, Massachusetts, but that is all Dr. Frost could find out. Frederick Vandewater discerned a precocious ruthlessness in Custer's harsh cheekbones and raptorial profile. No flexibility, no hint of a contemplative nature. This was the face of the archetypal swordsman, with deep-layered, challenging eyes above a rapaciously curved nose. Several of GAC's associates no doubt would concur. One, identified only as a gentleman who accompanied him through the Black Hills, noted that he had a tenacious memory and paid close attention to detail, but what he assimilated served only his memory, not his mind. He was no philosopher. He could reel off facts from his mind better than he could analyze or mass them. He was not a student, nor a deep thinker. He loved to take part in events rather than to brood over them. His Civil War orderly, Joseph Fought, writing about their experiences in 1863, recalled a determined leader who was at the same time curiously diffident. Soon after the Battle of Aldie, Custer approached with a paper in his hand. "I've been made a brigadier general," he said. Fought replied, "The deuce you have." "Yes," Custer said, and he read the paper aloud. Fought shook hands with him. "How am I going to get something to show my rank?" Custer asked. "Well," Fought said, "the rebels have just gone through here and have robbed and threatened everybody, but I will see what I can do." Late that night, according to the orderly's memoirs, "I found an old Jew, and in his place he had a box of things belonging to a uniform and some stars. I bought 2, then went back and found the captain in his room at headquarters. He was glad to have the stars, but who would sew them on? And where could we get a needle and thread? I scratched around and got them and sewed them on, one on each corner of his collar." Fought also mentions Custer leading a charge against a rebel force outnumbering his own 5-1. Such recklessness appears suicidal, like the mad charges of Indian warriors who called to each other that it was a good day to die. He seems to have been similarly fatalistic. "I've never prayed as others do," he once wrote to his wife. "Yet on the eve of every battle in which I've been engaged, I have never omitted to pray inwardly, devoutly. Never have I failed to commend myself to God's keeping, asking him to forgive my past sins and to watch over me while in danger. After having done so, all anxiety for myself here or hereafter is dispelled. I feel that my destiny is in the hands of the Almighty. This belief, more than any other fact or reason, makes me brave and fearless as I am." During the battle near White House Station, Virginia, an enlisted man was shot through the heart. He was even then in the death struggle, but I could not bear the thought of his being struck again, so rushed forward, and picking him up, bore him to a place of safety. Maybe this absolute lack of regard for his own skin contributed to his quick climb up the ladder. Such impetuous acts as leaping into the Chickahominy and darting beyond the line to rescue a dying soldier could not be ignored. These might not be qualities required of a senior commandant, but on lower levels an officer is judged personally by his men, and they will be influenced by his deportment. While he served on McClellan's staff, his natural exuberance blossomed into what could only be called flamboyance. The Army at that time was less totalitarian, or at least less standardized, than it is now, particularly in the matter of clothing. At West Point, a cadet wearing unauthorized gear would be skinned, but a private on active duty might not even be reprimanded. Officers in the field enjoyed still more freedom. Custer took advantage of this. He began to wear a tightly fitted hussar jacket, gold lace on his pants, and rebel boots. One staff member likened him to a circus rider. Faught recalled him wearing a dark blue sailor shirt that he got from a gunboat on the James, a bright red tie, a velveteen jacket with gold loops on the sleeve, and a Confederate hat. About this hat there remains some question. During the battle for Aldie, his wild charge took him so deep inside Confederate ranks that he was lucky to get out, and he attributed his escape to the fact that they mistook him for one of their own, not because he wore a rebel hat, but because it looked like one. Whatever he had on his head, it was not a regulation Federal hat. He wore it because his pale skin burned easily, and a regulation hat did not give enough protection. So it was practical, but he did like the rakish set of it above those reddish-gold curls dripping almost to his shoulders. He insisted that his costume, especially the cherry necktie, had a purpose. He wanted the troops to recognize him, to know that he was with them, not cowering behind the lines. And of the manifold accusations slung around his neck, timidity never was one. He rode in front, always, and at Gettysburg a high percentage of the luckless wretches who followed him were killed or wounded. Another time he led 400 volunteers on a saber charge against an entire Confederate division and lost 86 men. It was theatrical, audacious, and it stopped the rebel advance, which was the intent, but military analysts believe that cautious defensive maneuvering would have accomplished the same thing at less cost. Like Crazy Horse, he almost always escaped unhurt. In a skirmish near Brandy Station he was cut by shrapnel. Otherwise he charged through the Civil War with nothing worse than a touch of influenza or poison oak. Between assaults on the enemy, he continued his assault on Elizabeth Libby Bacon of Monroe, Michigan, whom he had first seen when he was 10 years old. A neighbor said he got occasional jobs working for the Bacon family in order to hang around Libby. He was not received in her home. He was of good character, but the family just couldn't see him. The reason being that her father was a judge, his father was a blacksmith. They were quite ordinary people, no intellectual interests, very little schooling. During October of 1861, he spent a while in Monroe on leave, and there occurred perhaps the most traumatic day of his life. His behavior so embarrassed everybody concerned that just what happened will never be clear. But there is no doubt that he had been drinking, and that he lurched past the house of Judge Daniel Bacon, reeling, staggering, vomiting, falling on his ear, etc. Somehow, possibly crawling, he got back to his sister's house, where he disintegrated, and finally awoke to see Lydia on her knees praying for his deliverance from old Demon Rum. Whether he was appalled by Lydia on her knees, or the remembrance of what he had done, or perhaps understood that he did not have the stomach for booze, whatever the reason, he never again took a drink, not even wine with supper. When asked what he would like to drink, he would use the circumlocution Alderney, which is a breed of cattle named for an island in the English Channel. In other words, he would take a glass of milk. At this same time he renounced profanity, but here he was less successful. From that day on he swore very seldom, only once in a while, and without vigor, which was uncharacteristic. Whether Lydia lectured him about gambling is not known. Probably she did. By instinct he was a gambler, so it was impossible for him to quit entirely, but he tried. His struggle sounds like a textbook exercise in Protestant sin and redemption. In December of 1869 he gave Elizabeth a New Year's resolution in writing that he would cease and desist as long as he was married to play cards or any other game of chance for money. This was 8 years after Lydia shamed and scolded him, which means he was still at it. By 1871 he was momentarily on top of the devil, having spent 2 hours inside a casino without feeling the urge. You often said I could never give it up, but I've always said I could give anything up, except you. After much discreet, circuitous correspondence, he managed to persuade Elizabeth's father that he was not a bad sort, and that his intentions were honorable. She was allowed to communicate with him. "Oh, I scarce know how to write to a gentleman." The wedding approaches. she writes to cousin Rebecca Richmond. I'm going to Detroit to have my dresses made, and my underclothes made on the machine. I'm sending to New York for my silks. She asks Custer to wear his parade uniform for the ceremony. She plans her wedding gown, pea-green silk looped with yellow military braid, green silk veil. She will hold a bouquet of red roses tied with a yellow cord. She will not require a personal maid after they are married, but will need a colored housekeeper. February 9th, 1864. A few minutes after 6 p.m., they were united in Monroe's First Presbyterian Church by Reverend Erasmus J. Boyd, assisted by Reverend D.C. Mattoon. Custer dressed to the eyebrows. Gold braid, gold buttons, gold epaulets, blue frock coat, lightning rod pants. Cousin Rebecca wrote to her sister that Libby wore rich white rep silk with deep points and extensive trail, Bertha of point lace. Veil floated back from a bunch of orange blossoms fixed above the brow. Why she gave up the pea green for traditional white is not explained. The ceremony passed off to everyone's satisfaction, after which the couple departed for Cleveland en route to New York, thence to Washington, and military headquarters on the Rapidan. Wedding gifts were left on display, and Rebecca itemized them as meticulously as a pawnbroker. Silver dinner service from the 1st Vermont Cavalry, silver tea set, 7 pieces, 7th Michigan Cavalry, silver card case, card receiver, syrup cup, sugar spoons, berry spoons, thimble, gold-lined, napkin ring, 2 white silk fans, sandalwood, Mrs. Browning's poems, Whispers to a Bride, female poets, knit breakfast shawl, mosaic chess stand of Grand Rapids marble. From Howlett's Hill, New York, the bride wrote to her father that while visiting relatives, they danced in the kitchen. I had to sit right down on the floor to laugh to see Uncle Ben and Aunt Eliza dance their old-fashioned way. It was too amusing to see them bounding up and down. On the train to Washington, she met General Grant. Richard Henry Dana, who met Grant on another occasion, noted a slightly seedy look. Colonel Charles Wainwright described him as stumpy, slouchy, and western-looking, very ordinary. Elizabeth thought him ordinary, yet not unattractive, with sandy hair and greenish-blue eyes, and most considerate. He went out on the platform to smoke his cigar because he did not want to offend her. In Baltimore, the newlyweds attended a show where the great comedian Clark sent the bridegroom into laughing fits, and Libby remarked in a note to her mother that she felt like a red-cheeked Dutch milkmaid beside the city girls. She enjoyed old General Sickles. He does not use his cork leg, but goes on crutches. He's very agreeable, especially to the ladies. Then there is Abe Lincoln, the gloomiest, most painfully careworn-looking man I ever saw. We have sat in a box opposite him at the theater several times, and reports of his careworn face are not at all exaggerated. He, the president, shook hands with me, as with everyone, and I felt quite satisfied and was passing on, but it seems I was to be honored by His Highness. At mention of my name, he took my hand again very cordially and said, "So this is the young woman whose husband goes into a charge with a whoop and a shout. Well, I'm told he won't do so any more." I replied I hoped he would. "Oh," said the Prince of Jokers, "then you want to be a widow, I see." He laughed. War separates them, but Custer writes almost every day. "When I think of the sacrifices you have made for me, the troubles and trials you have endured to make me happy, the debt of gratitude you have placed me under, my heart almost fails me to think I have only the devotion of my life to offer you in return. Loving so fine a being truly and devotedly as I do, it seems impossible that I ever should or could be very wicked." Elizabeth responds to this and other such declarations. "Swept along as I am in the current of your eventful life, I can still stop to realize that your history is simply marvelous. Every event seems to fit into every other event, like the blocks in a child's puzzle. Does it not seem strange to you?" In the spring of 1864, he continued his bravura performance during the so-called Wilderness Campaign, leaving 1/3 of his men hors de combat. Yet, just as his regiment earlier had stopped a division, now his brigade mortally slashed General Jeb Stuart's Confederates. Stuart himself died with a bullet in the stomach. On and on goes the slaughter. Custer brushes his teeth with salt, treats his wavy hair with oil of cinnamon, compulsively washes his hands. Elizabeth writes to her parents from Washington about ambulances passing with flag-draped coffins, government hearses, wounded soldiers in the streets. She mentions that during one battle he lost everything except his toothbrush, which must mean that he habitually carried it in a pocket. "He brushes his teeth after every meal. I always laugh at him for it, and for washing his hands so frequently." She is terrified that he will be killed. She passes the afternoon with a box of watercolors. "If you had come in today, you would have found your little wife in a common, rather short dress, no hoops, and hair tucked up, busy painting. I can't sit at my easel with hoops on, so I become rather primitive in style." One day she meets her bridegroom at Harper's Ferry, and next day from camp he writes, "My dear little army crow, following me around." She describes to the folks at home a Virginia mansion where they are billeted. "Mother, if once you had colored servants, you would never want any other. Mrs. Glass used to have 19. Now she has but 2, and has to do without many things we think indispensable. It's so pleasant here." Her husband leads a cavalry charge while she waits at the mansion. "I have a lovely little horse. I jumped a ditch with it yesterday." The butchering continues. Not many Civil War officers worried about losses if an objective was gained. On June 3, 1864, at Cold Harbor, the Union leadership sacrificed 7,000 men in a few hours. Sherman remarked in a letter to Elizabeth years afterward that the object of war is to produce results, a statement which cannot be argued. Even so, Custer lost more men during his berserk charges than most cavalry officers. Wherever he met the enemy, he advanced like a fighting cock. The impression he gave of himself, somewhat deliberately, was that of a preposterous figure, very nearly comic, which he was and which he was not. Behind the pranks and the outrageous costume rode a killer. Ordered by Grant and Sheridan to execute guerrillas without trial, he obeyed with no regret. At Front Royal, Virginia, on September 23, 1864, Federals caught 6 of Mosby's Rangers. Mosby, the gray ghost who came close to killing Reno on the Middlebury Road a few months later. Somebody shot 4 of Mosby's men while the band played The Dead March. The other 2, Carter and Overby, were hanged, and to Overby's dangling corpse a note was pinned. "Such is the fate of all Mosby's gang, hung in retaliation for the death of Lieutenant McMaster, 2nd U.S. Cavalry." J. Monahan, in a heavily documented, if rather cloying biography of Custer, implies that the federal unit responsible for executing these men was commanded by Colonel Peter Stagg. In either case, Mosby thought Custer did it. 3 weeks after the execution, a 7th butternut guerrilla was strung up by Colonel William Powell. Mosby sent word of these atrocities to Robert E. Lee, adding that he meant to hang an equal number of Custer's men. Lee endorsed the savage decision. "Respectfully referred to the Honorable Secretary of War, I have directed Colonel Mosby through his adjutant to hang an equal number," to which the Honorable Secretary, J.A. Seddon, added that General Lee's directive was "cordially approved." Thus at Rectortown, Virginia, 27 prisoners from Custer's brigade were told to draw slips of paper from a hat. The 7 losers were then escorted toward Berryville on Winchester Turnpike, because Mosby wanted to hang them as close as possible to Custer's headquarters. It was a black, rainy night. Along the road, 1 prisoner escaped, allegedly because both he and the guard were Masons. 5 of the other 6 being properly dispatched, a miscalculation was observed. The lynching party had not brought enough rope. A logical solution was to shoot the last victim, so a ranger drew his pistol and fired. The hammer snapped, but nothing else happened, and a moment later the Yankee bounded out of sight. Why this prisoner had not been tied up is curious, especially since 1 man already had escaped. It sounds as though the executioners found their job distasteful and gave the doomed men every chance. Monahan believes 2 others got away or survived by feigning death. Whatever the exact truth, Mosby pinned a note to one of the dangling bodies. "These men have been hung in retaliation for an equal number of Colonel Mosby's men, hung by order of General Custer at Fort Royal. Measure for measure." In October of 1864, young General Custer commanded a division for the first time, his opponent being his former West Point roommate, Thomas Tex Rosser. Custer charged. The Confederate line broke. Rosser's supply train, ambulances, and private wardrobe wagon were captured. Custer thought it would be amusing to try on Rosser's uniforms, which did not fit, as he knew they would not, because Rosser was a large man. Soon a message arrived. "Dear Fanny, you may have made me take a few steps back today, but I'll be even with you tomorrow. Please accept my good wishes and this little gift, a pair of your drawers captured at Trevilian Station. Tex." After shipping Rosser's gold-laced Confederate gray coat to Elizabeth, Custer replied, "Dear friend, thanks for setting me up in so many new things, but would you please direct your tailor to make the coat tails of your next uniform a trifle shorter? Best regards, G.A.C." This relationship is as easy to understand as it is astonishing. Two professional soldiers, good friends, attempting to destroy each other. Back and forth they fought. If one felt obliged to retreat, he abandoned the field with courtly grace. Union troops managed to round up a Confederate beef herd, but Rosser counterattacked so nimbly that Custer himself had to cut a switch and join the cattle drive. And in a letter to Elizabeth, he chortles over the fact that he has captured a raccoon and a squirrel from his roommate's menagerie. It sounds less like the Civil War than a tactical game at West Point. The Confederate General Joseph Kershaw, waiting at Custer's headquarters to surrender on April 6, 1865, noted his arrival. A spare, lithe, sinewy figure, bright, dark, quick-moving blue eyes, florid complexion, light, wavy curls, high cheekbones, firm-set teeth, a jaunty, close-fitting cavalry jacket, large top boots, Spanish spurs, golden aiguillettes, a quick, nervous movement, an air telling of the habit of command, announced the redoubtable Custer. He worked longer and harder than normal men. He could demand almost anything of his body, and it would respond. His chief of staff, Colonel Edward Whitaker, observed him one night just before the war ended. He was sitting upright on a log with a coffee cup in one hand, and his eyes closed, fast asleep. In Wilmer McLean's home at Appomattox, when the papers were signed, Lee ensconced like an emperor behind a marble-topped table in the center of the room, Grant in a rumpled uniform at a little pine table. As soon as their signatures declared an end to those tumultuous years, the ambience changed. The rebel Fitzhugh Lee, who knew Custer at West Point, walked up to him outside McLean's home. They embraced and fell to the ground, wrestling like schoolboys. Mementos of Appomattox were sold, and for 2 $10 gold coins, Sheridan bought the pine table, which he gave to Custer, telling him it was a present for Elizabeth. Custer rode away with this important table balanced upside down on his head. Jefferson Davis once remarked lightly while chatting with a great-granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin, "War between North and South? My dear madam, inconceivable. 2 friendly nations, rather, living side by side." Now this indivisible nation was again stitched together. Yet it remained an uncomfortable alliance. The suture could very nearly be traced on a map. And Ulysses Grant directed Sheridan to do something about the restless Southwest. Little Phil ordered 4,000 troops under Major General Wesley Merritt to San Antonio, another 4,000 under Custer to Houston. Elizabeth went along. It was a tedious trip, first by rail, then by steamboat down the Mississippi to New Orleans, up the Red River to Alexandria, overland to their destination. The last segment of this journey being especially boring, jolting, and at times oppressive. Custer arranged for his wife's comfort by ordering a spring wagon to be rain-proofed, embellished with curtains, and drawn by a team of 4 matched grays. The seats were altered so she might lie down if she felt tired. There was a pocket for her shawl, books, and needlework. Some congenial soldier fitted a canteen with a leather jacket and stitched Lady Custer into it with the yellow silk used by saddlers. One result of such solicitude was that Elizabeth became known to enlisted men as the Queen of Sheba. Custer did not know this part of the South. In a letter to his father-in-law from Alexandria, He wrote that it reminded him less of Virginia than of Uncle Tom's cabin. He saw a negress whose back was scarred by 500 lashes, and he reflected that if the war accomplished nothing else, it had at least abolished this evil. Yet he himself resorted to the lash. Congress prohibited flogging as a disciplinary measure on August 5, 1861, but Custer seems to have felt that this proscription did not apply to GAC. He announced 25 lashes and a shaved head for a man who was caught stealing fruit, and he served up the same punishment for equally trivial crimes on other occasions. Headquarters, 2nd Cavalry Division, September 14, 1865. Captain Davidson, commanding Provost Guard. You will at once shave the head and lash G. Darr, Company G, 12th Illinois Cavalry, and H. Cure, 1st Iowa. 2 soldiers, half-starved during the interminable march to Houston, got 40 lashes apiece for butchering a calf, and Lieutenant Thomas Cogley wrote in History of the 7th Indiana Cavalry Volunteers that the illegal order was carried out despite the protests of subordinate officers. This outrage won for Custer the lasting hatred of every decent man in the command. An Iowa veteran, commenting 20 years afterward, said that during the Civil War he had camped in Missouri snow a foot deep, found himself frozen to the earth in Arkansas mud, wrestled vermin in southern trenches, and been doubled up with cramps. But not until he rode through Texas in peacetime with General Custer did he face true hardship. He said that when they started westward from Alexandria, the men were instructed to report in ranks with their coats buttoned, and to carry a carbine, revolver, 70 rounds of ammunition, and a saber. The temperature was about 120 degrees, and there wasn't a rebel in the land. When the division reached a narrow bridge that had to be crossed in single file, Custer and staff stood on either side of the line with sabers drawn, and where a soldier overcome with heat had fastened his carbine, revolver, or sword to the saddle, they clipped it off and let it fall into the stream. The arms were charged to the soldier. Many a poor fellow I've seen with head shaved to the scalp, tied to a wagon wheel and whipped like a dog for stealing a piece of fresh meat or a peach from an orchard by the wayside. GAC himself rode unencumbered by equipment and frequently changed horses. The troops often saw him prancing ahead on a fresh, powerful mount. Emmett West wrote in History and Reminiscences of the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry that he did not think it strange the men hated Custer. I can compare his inhuman treatment of the men under him that summer to nothing I saw or experienced in 4 years' service, but the inhuman treatment of the Union prisoners at Cahaba by Colonel Jones. The food on this trip could have been improved. Reports speak of hairy hog jowls, maggots, bread like stone. Some cavalrymen preferred the raw corn allocated to their horses. Officers ate reasonably well, at least by comparison, and the general's table was decently supplied, often through his own efforts with a rifle or shotgun. He would halt the entire column if he spotted a covey of quail. There was no reason to occupy this territory, said Emmett West, because there were no armed rebels. Men sickened and died, everybody suffered, nothing was accomplished. It was simply a great picnic excursion for General Custer. Elizabeth, in her renovated spring wagon, was aware of these ragged, sullen troops, and she did not want to be an inconvenience. Every morning Custer delayed the march until she was ready. She worried about this. 4,000 men might be held up while she looked for a hairpin. Overnight, a heavy dew accumulated in East Texas. My husband lifted me out of the wagon when reveille sounded into the tent, and by the light of a tallow candle I had my bath and got into my clothes. Then, to keep my shoes from being soaked with the wet grass, I was carried to the dining tent and lifted upon my horse afterward. The division was stationed for a while at Hempstead, 50 miles northwest of Houston, and the local gentry sometimes invited him to go hunting, invitations he happily accepted. Each hunter brought his own pack of hounds, a spectacle which delighted Custer. He was entranced to learn that despite the multitude of dogs and horns, each animal would respond to the horn of its master. So he bought himself a horn and practiced, and 5 dogs, which had been presented to him, would arrange themselves in an admiring and sympathetic semicircle, according to Elizabeth, accompanying all of his practicing by tuning their voices until they reached the same key. One member of the Hempstead pack was a greyhound named Byron, a most lordly dog, she remarks. The tribute that a woman pays to beauty in any form I gave to Byron, but I never cared much for him. A greyhound's heart could be put into a thimble. Byron cared for the general as much as his cold soul could care for anyone. The general who would order an enlisted man lashed for a negligible offense could be uncommonly solicitous of a dog. They were given a female pointer named Ginny, and one morning they learned she had given birth to 7 pups under the Negro quarters at the rear of the house. Custer thought this was not a good place for Ginny to nurse them, but instead of directing an orderly to move the pups, he himself crawled under the house, which was set on low pilings, and tenderly handed them out one at a time. Ginny's bed was in the hall, but Custer decided this was inadequate. He placed the mother and 7 pups on his marital bed, and Elizabeth reports in Tenting on the Plains that one night he paced the bedroom for hours with a sick puppy in his arms. On October 30th, the command moved to Austin, where it remained until mustered out of service. Occasionally, the troops would be asked to help local authorities enforce the law. Otherwise, they had nothing to do. Almost every day, the general took his lady for a ride through the countryside. Frequently, they would be accompanied by a regimental band, and they would pause for lunch on some hilltop. Atop Mount Bonnell, which Elizabeth misnamed Brunel, they enjoyed the view while listening to such popular numbers as the Anvil Chorus. She remarks that the music descended through the valley grandly. Once they visited the state insane asylum with a band which could play music appropriate for dancing. There, she says, we watched with wonder the quadrille of an insane 8. His favorite excursion was to the Texas State School for the Deaf. Elizabeth writes in Tenting that he stared at the supple fingers and wrists of the deaf children, and as their instructor spelt the passions of love, hatred, remorse, and reverence on his fingers, one little girl represented them by singularly graceful gestures, charming him and filling his eyes with tears. J.P. Dunn states in Massacres of the Mountains that Indians and deaf mutes who have been brought together experimentally are able to communicate through ideographic signs, from which Dunn concludes that certain signs must be the natural expression of thought, and thus might be a more natural method of communication than vocal language. For instance, peace or friendship is made clear by an open hand, to show that one does not hold a weapon, which is quite probably how the custom of shaking hands originated. One may characterize a white man by pulling a finger across the forehead to mark the brim of a European hat. Who could mistake the significance of a finger twirled beside the head? What Custer learned from his visits to the school for deaf children, and how well he utilized the knowledge when he dealt with Indians, can only be conjectured, but he seems to have become fairly good at this mute speech. Not long after being stationed in Texas, he used his hands to address a council of Sioux, Apache, and Cheyenne chiefs in Kansas, and his oration was understood. And the Eureka Scout Red Star, who got to know him later in Dakota Territory, thought he expressed himself pretty well. At the end of 1865, when the Army of Occupation was dismantled and the troops began leaving Texas, a great many soldiers bade goodbye to this paradoxical man without regret. Emmett West departed happily on foot, walking 100 miles to the town of Brenham, where mechanical transportation was available to points north and east. Custer did not accompany these marchers, so they did not have to walk all the way to Brenham 4 abreast, and for slight offenses have heads shaved and receive 25 lashes. We never saw more of Custer, nor had any desire to. If the general perceived this hatred, he did not allude to it.